Okay, so you guys sent in some really interesting stuff for us to look at, specifically this article focusing on common mistakes that people make when they're learning English. And it's really cool, I think, to kind of dig into this and figure out why these mistakes happen,
Yeah.
so you can avoid them and save yourself some time and a little bit of frustration too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost like having like a cheat sheet,
Yeah.
where you can just sort of like bypass all those potential pitfalls.
Exactly. So, like, instead of getting lost in all the rules in the textbooks, you can just be like, oh, yeah, I know about that one. I'm not going to fall for that trick.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's jump right into it. So this article starts off with a pretty fundamental thing: word order. Now, obviously, for native speakers, like, subject, verb, object, SVO.
Yeah.
This is how they think, right?
They're
It's
wrong.
totally natural. But of course, not every language works that way. And this article really highlights how English is like pretty strict about this structure. It uses the example of I eat an apple, right?
Mhm.
Super simple, super basic. But then you flip it around and you say, eat I an apple. You're like, whoa, hold on. Something's wrong here.
Yeah, it just sounds so strange.
So that's kind of the key takeaway for you guys listening. In most in-deep sentences, the subject, the one doing the action, that comes first, then the verb, what they're doing, and then the object, the thing that is being acted upon.
Yeah, and that SVO order, it's just like built into the DNA of the English language.
Mhm.
And I think that's where learners who come from languages with a bit more flexibility in their word order, they really struggle with that sometimes.
That makes sense.
Because they're used to being able to kind of move things around a little bit more freely, and then they come to English and it's like, no, 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 you got to stick to this very specific order.
Took a formula on those.
It is, it's like a formula.
Okay, so another area where the article says a lot of learners trip up is overusing the present continuous tense.
Uh-huh.
The ing form of the verbs,
Right.
and walking is running, that kind of thing. And they give this great example of, I am liking this movie, when really you should just say, I like this movie.
Right.
But here's the interesting thing. It's not that you can never use the present continuous, right?
Right.
It's specifically with certain types of verbs, the ones that describe states or feelings or preferences
Yeah.
instead of actions that are actually happening right now.
Right.
Like you wouldn't say, I am knowing the answer, would you?
Right.
You just say, I know the answer.
Exactly.
And those kind of verbs, they're often about feelings,
Yeah.
like love, hate, or senses, see, hear, smell, things like that.
Yeah, or even thoughts.
Um,
Believe, understand, or
okay.
like possession, have, own. So it's helpful to sort of categorize those verbs in your mind so you can be like, okay, is this describing something that's generally true, or is it something that's happening right at this very moment?
Gotcha. So it's about whether it's like permanent or temporary.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about those little demons of the English language.
Mm-hmm.
Prepositions.
Yes.
The on, at.
Ugh, the bane of every English learner's existence.
Seriously. And the article mentions how, like, the way we use them in English doesn't always translate directly from other languages.
Mm.
So it's no wonder people get confused. We've all heard someone say, I am in the bus, instead of on the bus. Right?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah. So the article gives these examples. You're in the car because you're enclosed in a smaller space.
Mm.
You're on the bus because you're thinking about, like, being on board a larger vehicle.
Right.
And you're at the party, referring to like a specific event or location.
I think the trickiest thing with prepositions is that they're so dependent on context.
Right.
They can have so many different meanings depending on the verb and the noun that they're connecting. So it's not always a simple rule you can just memorize. You really have to kind of get a feel for how they're used in different situations.
Yeah, it's like there are these little puzzle pieces that have to fit in just the right way.
Exactly.
All right, now let's move on to articles. A and the. The article makes a good point that these are super important in English, and if you leave them out or use the wrong one, it just sounds strange to a native speaker.
Yeah,
Like the example they give, she is doctor versus she is a doctor, it makes a big difference.
it does.
Of
Fear.
course, remembering when to use a da and when to use an al is key too.
Right. That depends on the sound of the word that follows.
Exactly. A before a consonant sound and before a vowel sound.
Uh-huh.
So it's all about whether you're talking about something general like a doctor or something specific like the doctor we saw yesterday.
Right. And I think what's really interesting about articles is that they tell us whether a noun is specific or not,
Yeah.
like whether it's one particular thing or just any example of that thing.
Okay.
And that's something that a lot of languages don't really have, so it can be a new concept for learners.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it's important.
It is.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how English sounds, specifically pronunciation.
Okay.
And the article focuses on vowel sounds in particular, like the difference between beat and bid,
Mm.
or that A sound in cat.
Right.
And the point they make is that some of these sounds, they just don't exist in other languages.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that learners have trouble with them. And they give us a great example. I have a sit on the table versus I have a set on the table.
Right.
And it's like, wow, just that tiny little difference in the vowel sound changes the entire meaning of the sentence.
It does. And I think this really highlights the importance of actually like physically practicing the sounds.
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
know, paying attention to how you're shaping your mouth and your tongue and really listening to how native speakers pronounce those sounds.
It's like you're training your mouth to do something new.
Exactly.
Okay, next up we've got subject-verb agreement.
Uh-huh.
And this is a big one, especially that third-person singular present tense.
Right.
The article gives the classic example of she go to school every day, which is incorrect.
Yeah,
It should be she goes to school every day.
Right.
And it's like that little S that you have to add for he, she. And it in the present tense, it seems so small, but it makes a huge difference grammatically.
It does. It might seem like a tiny detail, but it's one of those things that native speakers really notice.
Yeah.
So getting it right really makes your English sound much more polished and fluent.
It shows that you've got a handle on the basics.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about something that can cause some real communication breakdowns.
Yeah.
Double negatives.
Oh, yeah.
The article is very clear that while some languages use double negatives for emphasis in English,
Mm-hmm.
they pretty much always cancel each other out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say, I don't need no help, it actually means you do need help,
Right.
which is probably not what you intended to say.
Yeah, that's a recipe for confusion.
So the correct way to say it is, I don't need any help. And that's just a rule you kind of have to memorize.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that's just different in English.
It is. It's a good example of how you can't always translate directly from your native language.
Okay.
You have to learn the rules of the game in English.
Okay, let's move on to something that can make your English sound a lot more fluent and sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
Avoiding the overuse of very.
Okay.
And the article points out that while very is a perfectly fine word, it's just that if you use it all the time, your language starts to sound kind of repetitive and a little bit boring.
Right.
Like instead of saying very smart, you could say intelligent or brilliant.
Uh-huh.
And it just adds so much more color and interest to your language.
It does. And I think this is really about expanding your vocabulary and using more precise words.
Right.
Instead of relying on that one little word, very, to do all the work.
Exactly. So it's all about choosing the best word for the job.
Exactly.
All right. The article also talks about a really important distinction between countable and uncountable nouns.
Okay.
So countable nouns are things you can count individually, like books or chairs.
Right.
And uncountable nouns are things you can't really count, like water or furniture. And this difference, it affects which quantifiers you use. So you would say many books, but much water.
Uh-huh.
And they give the example of, I have many furniture, which is incorrect. You should say, I have much furniture.
Right.
So it's a grammar rule that's easy to overlook, but it can really make a difference in how natural your English sounds.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can trip up even advanced learners sometimes.
Right.
Because it's not always obvious which nouns are countable and which ones aren't.
Yeah. All right. Finally, the article talks about the danger of literal translation.
Right.
And this is something that I think every language learner struggles with at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you're trying to express yourself in a new language,
Yeah.
and your brain just automatically wants to translate word for word from your native language.
Right.
And the article gives this perfect example of saying, I have 20 years, instead of I am 20 years old.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's a direct translation from a lot of other languages,
Mm.
but it just sounds so strange in English.
It does.
So the point is,
Yeah.
you have to kind of let go of that word-for-word translation and start thinking in English.
Exactly.
And the best way to do that is to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Read books, watch movies, listen to music, talk to native speakers, and just absorb those natural phrases and expressions.
Yeah, and the more you do that, the more you'll start to develop an intuition for how English really works.
Exactly.
And you'll be able to express yourself more fluently and naturally.
So there you have it. 10 common mistakes that English learners make, all laid out for you in this article. We've really gone deep into each one, explored why they happen, and most importantly, how you can avoid them.
Right.
So hopefully this deep dive has given you that extra bit of knowledge you need to learn English more effectively and confidently.
Yeah.
And here's a little challenge for you to keep in mind as you continue your English learning journey.
Yeah.
The next time you're listening to English, whether it's a movie or a conversation or even another deep dive. Try to actively listen for these 10 common mistakes. See if you can spot them. And even better, try to apply the correct grammar and vocabulary in your own speaking and writing,
Right.
because that kind of focused attention and practice will really help you master the language faster. And remember, mastering the basics, it's not just about being grammatically correct. It's about unlocking deeper levels of understanding and being able to truly connect with others in English.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of common English mistakes. See you next time.
See